like to introduce Andreas Hucks, who is the CTO of Sensor Labs Germany, where he's helping Sensor clients build modern quality web applications. His passions are clean code, testing and quality assurance, automation, and application architecture. He has extensive project experience with Symfony throughout its history. He's doing development, consulting, coaching, and contributing to the community. This is Symfony 5, the new bits. Andreas, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Stefano, very much. Yeah, hi and welcome to my talk. So this is called Symfony 5, the new bits. My name, as Stefano already introduced me, is Andreas. I work for Sensor Labs. Sensor Labs is the company behind Symfony. I've been doing Symfony for like virtually forever, like since 2005, and yeah, we do consulting for everything PHP related, with a focus on Symfony, of course. And yes, so let's get started. The title is Symfony 5, the new bits. That was the title for the PHP day in spring, and I thought what I should actually do with this, because Symfony 5 came out at the end of November 2019. So with the whole COVID thing and pushing the conference, I thought what I should call this like the almost new bits now, or the bits that would have been new in spring. But I've settled for just calling the Symfony the new bits, because of course we had at the end of May the release of Symfony 5.1, and so there's actually some new stuff that I've added to the talk, and some stuff that I cut out. But of course it's still about Symfony 5, and yeah. Let's take a very brief, like a single slide brief history. Look at the history. Symfony 5 is still based on the overall architecture that was developed with Symfony 2 10 years ago, and which has been incrementally updated through the major versions. We have a fixed release cycle, or we have had a fixed release cycle since 2.3, and that release cycle means that we have fixed time releases. So we have a minor release in May, and so like at the end of May, and a minor release in November, and every 2 years we have a double release, actually, which is the what we call the LTS version, the long-time support version, which is the .4 minor version, which comes at the same day, on the same day as the next major version. So last November, when Symfony 5 was released, there was also released Symfony 4.4, and according to the backwards compatibility promise, the difference between those two versions is mainly that deprecations are removed, and deprecations are removed, or you could say that the next major version is the previous version minus the backwards compatibility layer, you could say. So this is of course just talking about the code. And there might be other things that change, like the directory structure, like some configuration basics, but the source code of the framework is, as I said, just the last LTS minus the backwards compatibility. So with that said, just the last word of the LTS, because that's something that we see quite often when we go to clients. We see teams working with an LTS. So people, like, let's say now people might start a new project and they might be using Symfony 4.4, even though we are at 5.1 now, with the reason that this is the LTS. Basically, the answer is don't, because every stable minor version is just as stable as the LTS, and with the backwards compatibility promise, so you can always upgrade to the next minor version. That means that you are going to end up with an LTS anyway. So if you start now with 5.1 and it's not an LTS, you can still do that, and you will be able to upgrade to 5.4 in end of November 2021, and that will be an LTS. So there's no reason to start with an older LTS, just as a recommendation. So we start with a sort of new features, because these are actually features that have also been in 4.4, which, as I explained, is has a lot of common with 5.2.0. Before we are going in the second part of the talk, I'm going to go into Symfony 5.1, of course. So a few new things. There are also a lot of deprecations. As you know, deprecations pile up in the minor versions and are then removed at the next major version. So there's a lot of stuff that is gone in 5 and that you need to be aware of if you upgrade. But I've pushed that. This is just optional at the end of the talk if there's time left, because this should be about the new things. And of course, now there's more new stuff with 5.1. So we're leaving out the deprecations for now. The container linter, these are smaller features that have been in 4.4. But are nonetheless quite important, I think. One is the container linter that is now capable of linting your service config, which is something that in some cases might not have been noticed before. So this is something that you should include in your build pipeline. Just lint the container configs to make sure everything is syntactically correct. We have a secrets module, which so if you work with Ansible Vault or stuff like that, you might know the concept. So the idea is that we now can store secrets that would be relevant for staging or production in the repository by encrypting them. So all your production deployment needs is the private key to decrypt this. So everything else except the private key can go into the repository and be saved there. So this is a huge convenience feature. Then there's the Messenger. The Messenger has been around before, but Messenger was marked as experimental, which is a concept I'm going to come to later when we talk about the new experimental features. So it's now stable, and Messenger is now part of Symfony. Same goes for Panther. Panther is an extension or to, well, not only to the functional testing capabilities of Symfony, but also something that can be used as a crawler. Basically, it's a PHP wrapper around the API for a headless Chrome client. So you can do now stuff that previously was not possible in Symfony functional tests. And Symfony functional tests have this middle ground where they can run the whole application without HTTP. So there's a command line client wrapping around the framework kernel, executing those tests. So you have a integration test running, but since it's running without PHP and not in a browser, you don't have things like loading of assets like CSS rendering, and of course no JavaScript execution. And with the headless Chrome client through Panther, you now have all of this. So that means that, and by the way, all of this is integrated with an API that's equivalent to the API of the Symfony functional test client, the existing one. So you can more or less just switch out these clients. There are a couple of methods that are new, like the wait for that you can see here. This is used if you want for asynchronous content to load and to test for that. So it's now possible to test single page applications in your Symfony functional tests quite easily, actually. The web link component adds web links to the headers for HTTP 2 features. There are more convenience features going into the for the test framework, the functional test setup. Most of these are like convenience things, but they allow you to write much more concise and readable functional tests. So if you've done functional tests in Symfony, you know that while they are very convenient and very easy to write, they can get it can be a lot of text and they can be very verbose and not that, or a little bit difficult to navigate. So these concise assertions help you to have much more readable tests. The last feature of that was added in 4.4 already, and so that is really important to me, is the NotPwn validator. As you might know, if you don't know that, you should have. You should get to know that there's this have I been pwned database that collects passwords leaked in known data breaches, that you can search if your password for an email address has actually been leaked anywhere. So the new validator does actually just that, and talk back to that API. It does not send your clear text password and just a hash that is then able to be compared to the database of have been pwned, and tell you if your password has been leaked that you're choosing. So this is quite nice. That validator, that concrete constraint, also uses the new HttpClient, which is one of the big new features that became stable in 5.0. And the first question many people ask is why? Because there is, of course, Guzzle and other clients that are quite mature. And the reason is that we wanted something easy to use, something with a stable API between versions that you can more easily integrate into Symfony and have a better DX, so better developer experience. You might have heard about the DX initiative, which is already a couple of years old. It's something that we've turned to after Symfony as a framework has gotten more mature over the years. We have turned to creating easier and better developer experiences. So this is part of that. Doing a simple request is fairly easy. Requests are asynchronous by default, so you can issue 2 requests and get the content, and both will be executed in parallel in the background. We have HTTP 2 support. It is possible through adapters to conform to PSR 18 and use parallel PSR 17 messages. And there's stream support, easy stream support, both in sending, like in this case, where I can post a larger file, and also when receiving. So in this case, we have the request, assign the response, and then use a client stream this response, and then can iterate over that. Good. Next component that got stable was Mime and the Mailer. And as you know, we had used Swift Mailer in the past. That is gone now. Swift Mailer was still a 5.2 library, very old. So there were a couple of issues using that. And the new Mailer takes a lot of cues, actually takes a lot of cues from the Swift Mailer. But builds on that for a better user experience and more flexibility. So we still have the concept of transports that can also be read from DSNs, as most things in Symfony can nowadays. The DSN can also support round robin or fallback transports. And then it's after you have a Mailer instance, which of course, if you're using the full stack Symfony, is done for you by Symfony, by the Mailer component, then it's fairly easy to send that mail. So the Mailer itself is not that big of a difference that you will notice when using that. The bigger thing is actually the creation of the messages, because one of the issues with Swift Mailer was that method chaining was a little inconvenient because return times were not fixed, and so auto completion would not work after some point. And so this is, in one way, this is very similar to what you know from Swift Mailer, but on the other hand, it's gone a little easier. Also, we have multi-part stuff. Of course, this is the high-level API for multi-part messages. It's also possible to have. Let me check that. This one, so you can assemble your messages individually with files, individual parts, and so on. But it's a lot of code, not something that you need to read right now. It's just so you know you can do that. But usually you are going to use the simple high-level API, and one of those high-level APIs. It's not only the email that I've shown in the previous slides, but there's a templated email which has a twig integration. So this finally lets you easily work together with Twig. So you have full Twig support, everything a Twig can do. There are also Twig filters and Twig functions in that package that allow you to integrate images like inline image data, inline CSS, stuff like that, Inky support for constructing HTML messages and stuff like that. That is all supported in the Twig package. Yeah. All right. Now that was the stuff that was in 4.4 and 5.0, and now let's get to the experimental features in 5, and then to those in 5.1, which are quite exciting, I think. So first off, what is an experimental feature? Symfony has this backwards compatibility promise, which on the one hand is one of the strengths of Symfony. So we don't break backwards compatibility between minor versions. You can rely on that. But this is only really, from a developer standpoint, this is only really feasible when you have established features. When you introduce completely new stuff, completely new components, the problem is that naturally the API will change. Some things will turn out to have been a bad idea. So you will need to have this changed. So what we do is we mark stuff as experimental, and that means this is exempt from the backwards compatibility process for a certain time frame. Usually this should be for a single minor version, so it should become or the experimental tag should be removed in the next minor version. It can be prolonged for a single version, like has been done with the Notifier component that I'm going to talk about but that's usually it. So yeah, 1 second. Okay, so one thing is the notifier, which is some people have asked me what's the difference, or what is this about what the connection is to the mailer. Actually, the mailer is just one way of sending notifications here. And so the idea is sending system notifications to the user. So this is not about broadcasting stuff. It's about single transactional messages. And it's an abstraction to do this across several channels. There is the browser. Actually, a channel is a concept that we'll see in a moment. So there are browsers, there are text messages in various incarnations, like SMS messages, short messages, and other stuff. There are chats like Slack that you can connect to, or Telegram. And there's of course email, and all of these are incorporated into the notifier. The notifier itself just has a send method, so it's very similar to a mailer, but only with some added features, which again depend on your actually notification. The notification itself is a fairly basic standard class that just has a subject, not necessarily a body text, but a subject, and can be assigned to some channels. These channels, as I said, can be like a browser, which will be a browser notification on the next request, like in Flash messages. In practice, this will be, or emails, or text messages. And you can then configure these channels to react to certain levels, similar to log messages that have different levels, and then have these messages routed to these channels depending on their severity, on other criteria that you can define. So when actually sending a notification, you just use that notifier send method and get rid of the notification, and the configuration then decides where this is routed to, if this is routed to multiple channels and whatever. For example, if your notification, like this would have shown previously, this is just a simple notification interface, but if you for example, want to have this specifically as an SMS sendable, then you can additionally implement that SMS notification interface, and which is just that single method as SMS messages, which then formats your notification into an SMS message so it can be sent as one. The channels, as I said, the channel have these are implemented. Implementing the channel interface, which just defines this notify methods. You can, in theory, build your own channels, although there are a couple of built-in channels, for example, that browser channel, which then does nothing else than simply use the flashback. That is a standard Symfony feature that most people who have worked with Symfony before know. It's been there since the beginning, basically. And so it simply adds the notification to the flashback, and what you can then do is, or in practice, like these were the interfaces and how they work. What you would do in practice probably is create your own notifications that implement all of these features and are then ready to use. So you get rid of all of these format-specific method calls like as SMS message and so on. So you can use your in this example, it's a confirmation notification, I've called this, and we want to be able to send this as email notification and as a chat notification. So we extend that base notification, implement these interfaces, and then all we have to do when we use that in our actual application, all we have to do is pass a subject. This then calls the parents, does some basic setup stuff. For example, we define that this default importance is always important because it's a confirmation. We also add an emoji which can be used to highlight things in chat messages, for example, through the chat channel. And then we assemble this as an email message, for example. So we simply need to return a new email message with an email that we can then assemble however you like. For sending this as a chat message, actually, it's even easier because the chat message has a from notification default a static method that does a default assembly as a chat message. Okay, another quite powerful feature is the string component. As you know, probably know or have seen at some point in your PHP career, working with strings in PHP can be fun. PHP, historically has a very interesting relation to strings and to UTF-8. So the idea is to create a component that provides you with a object-oriented interface to manipulate strings and do so with the ability to work with not only Unicode but graphemes and byte strings, for example. There are shortcut functions that you can use because, one slide back, this is a bit long. So in real life, you might probably want to start out with these functions that simply give you a byte string, a Unicode string, and then go on from there. And the Symfony, the string component then gives you a lot of operations that you can chain for string manipulation. Like case folding. Case folding actually is something that is surprisingly difficult. When you're viewing this from a Latin alphabet standpoint, it's pretty easy, but there are alphabets where case folding is a lot more complex than just like in English, for example. There's a slugger as well, which is something that it's a common feature that we always use. So you can use an SKI slugger, and the slugger is able to convert and transliterate all sorts of alphabets. Can be also, of course, further configured. Now let's get to 5.1 specific stuff, which is basically just in, and the probably the most important part, and from my experience, the biggest change for everyday work and projects will be the security change. So we have a new security system in place, which is experimental for now. So you can perfectly work with this in the same way with security as you've always done. But the new security system simplifies a lot. There have been attempts at simplifying the Symfony security layer before. The security layer is basically the same architecture as it was when it was introduced with Symfony 2.0. Then in 2.8, we had guards introduced. So guards were basically an abstraction layer on top of the authentication system that allows you to write your own authenticators, to add security features, authentication mechanisms on your own. For example, if you can easily or fairly easily write OAuth authentication for that by integrating existing OAuth libraries. But it's still fairly complex, and also those guards, they were basically a convenience feature that mixes a lot of concerns together for convenience sake. So the new system tries to clean it up. Also, the old security system had some limitations. For example, if you this old security system very much revolves around the concept of a user. Doing machine-to-machine authentication is of course possible, but the concept is a little different. You had to work around that a little. So other systems today, other frameworks use the concept of the principle for that. And things like two-factor authentication, which is required quite often today, is also, well, it's possible. The Symfony security system has always been flexible enough, but it's possible, but it's complex. So what changes? Basically, it's a complete overhaul. There are only guards now. Everything else is more or less gone from the framework user's perspective. Everything is event-based, and we only have 3 events that we need to know, and actually 2 of those are optional. So there's one event that's really important, and the guards work together with a new concept, and that's a passport, and that passport can represent a security principle that needs to be authenticated. Setting that up requires that you simply enable the new authenticator manager in your setup. And then you have in your guard, there are more methods, actually less than in the old guard authenticators, but there are a couple more methods. But the central one is authenticate. And that authenticate must return a passport interface. And that passport interface, there is a default passport implementation, but you can actually build your own passports for different methods of authentication. And there is, for example, this default one, the user passport takes the user and takes the password credentials. And password credentials then again take or the passport then takes so-called badges. Badges are additional requirements or features regarding security that are added to that passport, and all of these badges can be what we call resolved. So, and only if all the badges are resolved will the passport be valid for it. So in this standard example, this is taken from a form login. We have a CSRF token badge, so the login form is CSRF protected, and we have a passport upgrade badge, so we can see if the password that the user has needs to be upgraded and can act accordingly if necessary. And the passport interface just defines basically the ability to add badges and to get badges and to check for badges. And then check if all of these are completely resolved. Otherwise, this, by the way, this is not a Boolean return. This throws and is supposed to throw an exception, if a security exception, if one of the badges is not resolved. The badge itself, again, very simple interface. Just there is resolved Boolean that it returns, and so I can implement whatever it is. And we'll see an example of this in a moment. So the 3 events I was talking about that all of this is based on is the check passport event, the login success event, and the login failure event that you can write listeners for. A login success or login failure is, well, obviously things that you do after a successful login or failed login. The interesting thing for now is, for us in this talk, is the check passport event, which for example, is used in the CSRF protection listener. We've seen in the example just a couple of slides back, we had the CSRF protection badge that was added to that passport. And now this is the corresponding listener that at this check passport event takes the corresponding badge from the passport. So the passport is contained in that event. I've snipped that code out to make this less complex, but the passport is contained in the event. We can then take the badge from the passport, validate it or not, and then mark this badge as resolved, which will then let the process of validating these badges continue. So it's very easily extendable and quite flexible. Okay, other 5.1 features that are interesting. There are a lot more besides that security, but the security is probably the biggest change in Symfony that has been there for quite some time. I mean, there have been big things like Flex for Symfony 4, but nothing that really changes the way of doing things that much. So what else is new in 5.1? When we talk about security, this is actually just a tiny improvement code-wise, but it's one that I find very much love. Security and tests. So if you wanted to be logged in the past, you either had for functional tests to switch to HTTP basic authentication, which changed the process and which changed the setup of the security. So it was not ideal. Or you had to execute the login for every single test, which was slow and added tons of requests that were not needed. Or you had to force a security token into the container, which was complex. So this now lets you do this with a single method, client login user, and you're logged in without extra requests and without changing your security layer. So even while this is a small change, it's actually a big thing, I think. Route priority is another thing. Much requested in workshops that we see, much requested by clients. So you can order routes when doing route priority, when you do YAML configuration, but it's more difficult in with using annotations, which is the recommended way of configuring routes. So now we have this priority thing here, which would prioritize this route before that one, so we cannot have, the foo will not be interpreted as a route parameter for the bar foo bar path here. So this is an annotation only feature because it only makes sense for annotation. My personal recommendation, apart from this, from project experience, is it's better to try to resolve these kinds of conflicts using precise requirements for your routes, which is much cleaner than juggling around with priorities. But still, the feature is there, so if you need it, it can be quite convenient. In stack decorations, if you've worked with any kind of complex service configuration, you might have used decorators, which is probably one of the most underused and underrated features, I think, in service configuration, in decorating services. In the old way of doing this is if you have multiple levels of decorations, and this could be quite unreadable because there are several decorators and you always repeat the decorator class name, so it's not quite clear to read. So we now have a short syntax. The old syntax still works, of course, but we now have a short syntax for this, which is a stack decorator. So you only have a single service definition, and then you list your decorators in order. If each one of them takes their own arguments and so on. You now can deprecate services. Deprecating things is deprecating features is an important path if you develop libraries to make the transition process, the upgrading process, easier for your users. And this can be it's done through annotations and through hidden error triggering in the code. But if you have a bundle or something else with configuration and configure services, this is more difficult. So we now allow deprecating services through configuration. So you simply add the container private tag, and this will then give you a log message that this is deprecated since version 1.2 in this example. So you can include that. We have a UUID component. This is not a component that is supposed to replace a full-featured library like the popular Ramsey UUID, for example. That's still valid. But this is a simple implementation that allows you to quickly generate UUIDs and also ULIDs. A ULID is I've noted this, universally unique lexicographically sortable identifier. So it's a UUID that is sortable, which is a requirement that comes often into play and that a UUID cannot easily fulfill. Yeah, of course, for testing purposes and from reading from databases can be constructed from strings, can be converted through to strings. Last thing, more or less, or last full thing I want to show is reusable constraints. This is something that's surprisingly convenient. So if you want to write your own constraint, but don't need to write code, you just want to combine a certain set of constraints that are pre-configured, you can do so by simply extending a compound constraint and returning an array of existing constraints, be they, no matter if there are Symfony constraints or constraints from custom constraints that you've written yourself. You can combine them to a compound constraint, and this is then already usable as an annotation. So with just these few lines of codes, you now can use your matches password requirements constraint, for example, and reuse that in several places. Okay, other stuff that's more like minor things. You can now easily write single command applications in a single file. Similar to that, we have the microkernel is improved, so you can now write single file Symfony applications. So the kernel can now have service definitions. It can have route definitions and controller actions. So in a way, you could say that Silex is back with that new microkernel if you want to use it that way. You can now, other than that, you can now ignore serializer properties from the serializer. You can auto-wire public properties and, for example, encrypt session data. This is still not the full list, of course, but it should cover the most interesting things. And so, yeah, for now, this is this is basically the content for the new stuff. So what else is there? We have a new book out, which is Symfony, called Symfony 5, the fast track, which is something that we haven't had since basically Symfony 1, where we have a full book that develops a sample application from scratch and shows you all the feature. It's available for free online, or you can buy this on Leanpub, which is definitely a recommendation, of course. Okay, other than that, Stefano, we have, so I'm more or less done with this talk. I can either take questions now, or
Sure.
if there are no questions, I have a list
Yeah,
of
we already
deprecations
have
to
a
throw
few
at you.
questions down the line. So
Okay.
first question is there a plan to support only the Mailer component at some point? And at that point, what will happen to Swift Mailer then? Asking for a friend by Daniel.
Is there a plan? And sorry, is there a plan to only
to only support the Mailer component? And what will
Okay, so
happen to
basically,
Swift Mailer?
if there's a plan to remove the Swift Mailer.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Well, the official Swift Mailer support will end at some point. Yes. I don't think that's really that much of an issue, because instantiating a Swift mailer instance in itself is actually not that big, not that much work. So you can fairly easily create your own Swift mailer instance in as a regular service configuration, and after that, creating Swift mailer messages is not something that is related to service configuration anyway. It was done in the code always. So while there will not be official support for this, it's still not a big deal, I think, because if you really need to, you can still use Swift mailer with Symfony.
All right. So next question is, what do you think about the decision of moving away the configuration from XML to PHP only? This is for Massimiliano.
This is some point that I did not touch on in the talk, actually. So to elaborate, if you haven't heard about that, the idea is to move the service configuration. This is mainly about service configuration for now, at least, away from XML to PHP in bundles and in the Symfony base code. So it's already done in the Symfony core. It is recommended for Symfony libraries like bundles. And the reason is to make Symfony more independent from, or more standalone. So the general DX initiative centers around simplifying things, requiring less to learn, less formats, less configuration, and creating that PHP DSL, because that's basically what it is. There is a domain-specific language created in PHP that you can use to chain methods to configure services. So it's really quite easy and readable to do that now, and now it's not dependent on an extra XML format, on an extra YAML format anymore. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So next question is kind of related to the previous one. Will YAML be deprecated in the future too? What can we expect for Symfony 6, maybe something like that?
Yeah. I don't know. Basically, there is talk. What I've just explained about the PHP configuration mainly applies to service configuration, and at this point, it does not apply to the semantic configuration on application level for bundles, for example, or packages, because that is much more individual than service configuration. Service configuration is structured, so it is easy to create this domain-specific language for that. Doing that for generic configuration is not, so that application level files will stay in YAML for now. I don't know if that's be forever.
All right. One question that I can forward to you is, what of all these features, obviously you mentioned that the security one is the biggest one, but which is the one that makes you more excited about? Like, which is the one that you prefer personally?
Let me skip through this. Actually, in my daily work, actually the little ones like the string component, I love this, and probably from the new ones the ability to log into tests. It's very simple, tiny features, but compared to the other stuff. But that's for now the most exciting stuff, I think, apart from the security layer, of course.
Yeah, this should be it. I think we're done. The next talk is coming up in 4 minutes, so I guess we can set you free. Andreas,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank everybody for listening. It was a pleasure as always. Thanks.